All right, everyone. We have a wonderful, wonderful webinar panel prepared for you today with our three wonderful panelists. My name is Sharon. You go by she, her pronouns. I am the Financial Capacity and Training Manager here at Freeframe, and I will be your moderator today. We have an hour full of questions and information and really great resources from our panelists. We will be going through a couple of introductions, and then we'll go through a couple of prepared questions. However, I'm really hoping that we will have some time at the end for some audience Q&A. So during the chat or while our panelists are speaking, if you would like to ask a question, please feel to use the Q&A function, or you can privately privately message me if you would like to ask a question anonymously, and I can read that question off for you. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking, and I would really love our panelists to introduce themselves, and please let us know your name, your pronouns, and your connection to unions and unionizing. And I'm going to start with Kiki.
Hey, everybody. Here on the East Coast, good afternoon. If you're over yonder in the West Coast, good morning. Again, my name is Jerame Montero-Reyes. I also go by Kiki. I use she, her pronouns, and currently I am a clinician at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. My connections to union. So we were voluntarily recognized as our union, AVP Unites, back in April. And the questions will go way more in depth as to how that process looked like, the good, the bad, and the ugly, for sure.
Hey folks, my name is Jannine, and I'm here on behalf of Sanctuary for Families, Sanctuary United Union, part of NOSW, Local 2320 under the UAW umbrella. We're the staff union at Sanctuary, which is an agency that provides services for survivors of gender-based violence in New York City. We have about 230 staff in clinical, legal, residential, and economic empowerment services. And in August this year, we received voluntary recognition. So we're just a little bit behind AVP and Kiki. In the summer, over a team of extremely dedicated staff turned labor organizers unionized us in around 9 weeks. And right now we're doing all of the paperwork and all that formal stuff to become officially official so that we can negotiate our first contract. So we're pretty new to everything. Personally, I got into labor stuff because, well, my mom is in a union, but I didn't really get into things until I was an undergrad and I saw the graduate student unionize. And coincidentally, those graduate student workers are on strike at Columbia, and they're striking for dental coverage, sexual harassment process, and fair wages for workers. So you should support their demands. I'll put some stuff in the chat.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Jerame Davis. Excuse me. I'm the executive director of Pride at Work. Pride at Work is the official LGBTQ constituency group for basically all of labor. We're recognized by the AFL-CIO, which is the largest confederation or federation of unions in the country, as the official constituency group for LGBTQ union members. We work with right now, just over 30 unions who have partnered with us, and that's growing all the time. We actually just brought on a new union as a partner yesterday, which is pretty cool. So how I got involved is, strangely enough, it was through Pride at Work. More than 20 years ago, I was fired for being gay. Me and two other men were fired for being gay, and we worked in a convenience store. It wasn't unionized, but it was Pride at Work, and it was the members of the unions in the area who came to our support. Pride at Work taught us how to picket, how to have a press conference, how to speak to the media, how to write press releases, like all of those things that you need to run a campaign against a company. They taught us how to do. And ultimately, what ended up happening was we were the first LGBTQ discrimination case in the state of Indiana settled for a monetary award. They didn't have to settle. There was no requirement. There was no law. There's still no law in Indiana that protects LGBTQ people from discrimination. We can talk about the federal law and the protections there and so forth and so on that the Supreme Court just gave us last year. But 20 years ago, there certainly weren't any protections whatsoever for us. So I'm excited to be here and can't wait to get into this conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Super excited for you all to be here and so grateful for you to share your experience and expertise. So my first question here is for Jannine. So can you talk a little bit about why you believe unions are a survivor justice issue and why you feel like unions are necessary for the gender-based violence movement and how they can strengthen the movement?
Yeah, certainly. When we were organizing Sanctuary United, we were extremely intentional to frame our campaign, not just about the conditions of our agency, but really about the entirety of the movement to end gender-based violence, because we believe that unions are absolutely necessary to keep both our work going and to keep it equitable. Wages that don't support families really make this work unsustainable by increasing burnout and staff turnover, and it makes our work actually inaccessible to the communities that we serve by making this profession available only to people who can afford to take a pay cut. And I really want to offer a huge shout out to Free From, because they actually provided the research that put the data to what we already knew. So not only are unions really important to the movement, but really unions are a survivor justice issue in and of themselves. You know, we know that one of the key barriers to survivors leaving abusive situations is financial instability. We also believe in survivor empowerment. And at the same time, we know that union workers have higher wages than their non-union counterparts, and they have actual autonomy by being able to, you know, set the conditions of their work and of their lives. So of course, you know, unions are a survivor justice issue because we actually know that financial stability and autonomy, including workplace autonomy, are in and of themselves also survivor justice issues. And you know, the one unstated thing that's always present and is always a current truth that we carry with us is that so many of us who do this work are survivors or secondary survivors ourselves. And so shouldn't we be able to experience the things that we advocate for when it comes to our clients? And you know, speaking for myself, not on behalf of Sanctuary United, but I think one of the big motivating factors for me was that unions are super important for all of us who consider ourselves feminists, particularly when it comes to, you know, self-accountability in the movement. And, you know, the feminist movement has focused on autonomy and empowerment and individual choice, which is certainly nice, but I have to ask us, like, where has it led us? And you know what I mean when I say self-accountability is that we have this selective memory and this abdication of responsibility when it comes to what this neoliberal individual choice feminism that focuses on empowerment above all else has done for us and has done to others. You know, we don't remember Afghanistan as the feminists' war. I mean, maybe we remember saving Afghan women and Laura Bush doing her whatever and talking about how, you know, Muslim women were so oppressed. But, you know, we never mention how many people and players and really institutions in the feminist movement supported the war, actively campaigned for the war, fundraised for the war. The Feminist Majority Foundation, which is a huge, huge name in the feminist movement, actively campaigned for the war on the Afghan people. This was a 20-year war that killed over 250,000 Afghans, and that's by, you know, conservative estimates. And interestingly enough, the Feminist Majority Foundation actually does have a union. They unionized a couple years ago, and unsurprisingly, their management fought them tooth and nail over it. They had to go to an election process, which I'm sure we'll discuss later in the panel. But their campaign, the staff campaign for the union, mentioned actually acting on a feminism that wasn't neoliberal, that wasn't white, that was intersectional. And I think that's so, so, so important for us to remember that feminism is not some nebulous concept that's divorced from political struggle, but autonomy itself is really tied to collective action and individual choice, like choice to do what? Choice for individuals to do what? So, you know, if we want to remake the world that we want to see, if we want a future without violence, without the violence of white supremacy, without the violence of war, colonialism, imperialism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these things, without IPV, without all of these things, we have to have infrastructure to leverage our power. We need these collective democratic institutions that actually speak to the will of our political goals outside of the donor industrial complex, so that we can take back these institutions and take back what feminism means and what feminism does, what our movement does. And so, yes, I think importance are super important for feminists. I think they're important for people who want to end gender-based violence. And that's because I think that collective action is really how you remake reality, how you change reality.
Thanks, Jannine. Kiki and Jeremy, if you want to add anything to that, please feel right ahead to go do so. Otherwise, Kiki, my next question is for you. So obviously you were part of the efforts to unionize in your workplace. Can you talk a little bit specifically about how that process started in your workplace and how you specifically got involved with that?
Totally. Thanks for this question, Sharon. So can sound a bit like mystical, but in a way I inherited this kind of move to unionize, right? There were previous staff members, as far as I was reported to by other staff members, that kind of were whispering or kind of had shared the word union or were like, think about unionizing. But I think, as many folks talk about, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience think about, like, safety, right? Like, is it safe to discuss it? Who can I trust as my fellow colleague to even like start this work or start this conversation or recruit people, right? And so I think that's where, we were caught at the moment, right? I remember getting everybody else involved, like meeting in one of our colleagues' backyards, kind of starting just like signal chats or like kind of private chats, right? A lot of like eyes in terms of like, we should unionize, right? When something messed up was said in a meeting, or if something messed up was going on in the agency, right? And then at the beginning of COVID, or beginning of the pandemic, with the lockdowns in March, around last year, that springtime, we were facing concerns about losing our jobs with the impact of COVID on our finances. And as a collective, we just kind of decided enough. And so at that point, we were able to, luckily kind of gauge like who's kind of also tired and who would be, down to kind of have these meetings and think about unionizing. It's a lot of strategizing. Again, if there's anything I learned even before talking about unions, is that advocacy is strategizing. It's strategies, it's plans, it's safety planning, right? So, we leveraged our interpersonal connections with one another, right? We have to take into consideration, right, other people's positions and kind of navigating that like principle over personality, right? Especially, right, talking later about how we take care of ourselves. And like I said earlier, sometimes the messy parts of the process, the emotional parts of the process, right? There's a practical part to this, but there's also, again, that interpersonal and that emotional part to it as well. And so that's how I got involved, and that's what we look like. And then I didn't mention it earlier, but thankfully we were supported by OPEIU Local 153 when we were doing a bit of union shopping. I think that's what we called it at that time, to see who could really support us and who reflected our values, and who would be able to really support, especially our nonprofit space, our nonprofit workspace. So we're represented by them. Shout out Dana, as well as why am I blanking on her name, but she knows who she is. But thank you both for all the guidance that you've supported us. Because again, strategically, it's a lot of learning language. I'm still catching up with the vocabulary. In our prep work, Jeremy actually taught us a lot that we are still learning ourselves, and things that I hope to be able to roll off the tip of my tongue in the coming time as the union work continues.
So Kiki, I have a follow-up question to that. How do you know which colleagues are safe to chat about, and how do you know which colleagues to kind of maybe not bring this to right away?
Thank you for asking that. I think again, leveraging that interpersonal. Sometimes you have colleagues where it's like, you've had a couple vent sessions during happy hour. You've texted back and forth during staff meetings, and you just get a sense of like, I trust this person. But always keeping in the back of your head, like having to have that conversation if they feel like we should just talk to a supervisor about this, or like, why can't we just talk about it openly and like ask everybody, right? Also to that as well, I think too, it's just that safety planning. I think that was a huge part as well. And also with the help of OPEIU, kind of learning who in a way we couldn't talk to because of their position, right? Like even though they might be union eligible, depending on their position in certain departments or in relation to certain positions, there are people that we kind of had to wait to reach out to. Also for the safety of their role, knowing that if they would learn, it's possible that, they would have to disclose something to management, or, you know, maybe be put in a position that wouldn't be fair to them. So it's definitely a hard call sometimes, figuring out like who to talk to and when, especially because, again, that's where that emotional and the interpersonal part comes in, where, you know, sometimes you have to be accountable to why like that person feels left out, or, you know, why we had to wait a bit until we reached out to that person.
Thanks for sharing, Kiki. Jannine or Jeremy, anything you want to add?
I think Kiki actually covered it really well. When we started our campaign, I mean, from planning, like our first conversation, a couple of us being like, hey, this is something that we should think about again, to receiving voluntary recognition, for us, it was pretty quick. It was 5 months. And it was really to get it to happen that fast for an agency of 230, 240, meaning 160 staff who were eligible that we wanted in the union, eligible according to like their positions, AKA they were at management. We really had to plan. We had to strategize. For us, after we had, you know, gotten our organizing committee, we made sure that we had people who cut across the agency, because we have so many locations, so many projects, so many practice areas, all of these things. We wrote down everyone in the agency, and I'm sure this is exactly like every union has the same strategy. So I'm sure Kiki did this too with AVP. We write down everyone in the agency. We say, are they eligible? Are they not eligible? And then we say, how amenable do you think this person would be to hearing this conversation, to having this conversation about a union? And for people who we didn't think, who may be closer to management, or like Kiki was saying, perhaps because of their positions, they would be placed in situations that would be compromising to them. And we didn't want to make them, you know, carry that burden of, you know, what we were trying to do, which was we were trying to keep it discreet for a couple months before we went to management officially, to say, you know, these people, we're going to ask them the 11th hour right before we go public, so that they don't have to carry it around and we don't have to worry too much. But I think for us, we were having a super bold campaign. We were just outright asking people, hey, we're thinking about unionizing. Is this a conversation that you want to have? And being super explicit, hey, we'd really appreciate if you kept this discreet. We're not ready for management to know about this. I'd really appreciate you keeping this in confidence and you keeping this between us. And, you know, people, your coworkers, sometimes you can't always trust them, but oftentimes you guys work together, you work on some things that are super emotionally charged. There is a level of trust that builds. And for us, it worked out also because we were going really fast.
Thanks, Jannine. And before we get to our next question for Jeremy, I do want to emphasize here that unionizing is your legal right, right? So you absolutely, in any workplace, have a legal right to unionize. That doesn't mean it's always safe for everyone. So you really have to be, you know, cognizant and think thoughtfully through whether or not it's right for you, and how much involvement, if any, you want to have. But just want to lay it out there that unionizing is your legal right in any workplace, and management or your higher ups cannot discriminate against you or retaliate against you for trying to unionize or having those conversations about unionizing. Which actually leads me really well into my next question for Jeremy. So obviously you face a lot of discrimination in the workplace because of your sexuality and because of just who you are and your identity. Can you talk a little bit about how unionizing protects us in the workplace, especially for those of us who have been traditionally and often intentionally left out and discriminated against? So for people who are LGBTQ, for people who are survivors, people who may be parents, or people who are pregnant, how does unionizing protect us from discrimination?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So before I get to that, I do want to back up to that last question and just mention that you're absolutely right that it is your right to organize, but just to remember that so many employers do trample right over those rights. And, you know, you might get your job back, but if you lose your job and you lose it for months, you know, and what if all you get is back pay? So there are real risks that are involved too, which is why Kiki and Jannine are so right about the importance of picking who you talk to and when you talk to them. I think that's such a key thing. And, you know, Kiki brought up the fact that, you know, you may have to be accountable to people who feel left out when, you know, at the end of the process, you finally bring them in and say, hey, we want to form a union. And they're like, hey, why didn't you talk to me 3 months ago? That happens. So absolutely, all of that is true. And I would encourage everybody, the just aired season finale of John Oliver's show last week tonight with John Oliver was about union busting and all the tactics that are used and the laws that exist that protect you. Talks about you know, concerted activity, which is the crux of what's protected in the workplace, right? Concerted activity is anytime 2 or more workers get together and talk about fixing either their benefits, their working conditions, or their wages, or whatever's going on at work. You are totally legally allowed to talk about any of the problems at work with your coworkers, and you're allowed to talk about your salary too. They'll often tell you that you can't talk about how much you make to your fellow coworkers, but you can. Absolutely, it's legally protected. So keep that in mind as well. But how do unions protect those of us, you know, who need protecting, whether we're in a historically marginalized group or whatever? And that's, you know, first of all, unions are democratic, like we've been talking about. So participation matters, and who's in that union matters. So, you know, the power of collective action is in the group working together. And if everybody is represented in that group, you have a much better chance of the issues of everybody being addressed, right? And that's where the bargaining committee comes in. And so a bargaining committee is the folks that once you win recognition of the union and you start negotiating a contract, it's time to pick the people who are going to sit at the table and negotiate that contract with the employer, with management. That committee is so crucial because what you win, especially in that first contract, informs what you're going to win down the road. So you've got to have a committee that's committed to getting what you need, that's diverse, that understands the needs of every worker that works there and what their needs are. You know, a union contract can protect you from discrimination. It goes above and beyond what any state, local, or federal law provides, right? Because a union contract, it codifies those protections, and a union contract is enforceable by law. So there's that piece alone. But it also provides you, the union provides you with representation and somebody to walk you through the process. So if you are discriminated against in a workplace that's not unionized, you're pretty much on your own. You got to find your own lawyer. You've got to deal with everything. By the way, while I'm thinking about it, remember HR's job is always to protect the company, not you. They are there to protect the company. They are not your friend. The union is your friend. Your coworkers are your friends. The HR is not. So HR can't solve all of these problems. But you know, like I was saying, if you are in a non-unionized workplace, you're on your own. But if you have a problem in a unionized workplace, you have a team of people who have not only your back, but they have the expertise that's necessary to win, whether it's that grievance or whether it's, you know, an unlawful firing and they get you your job back. Like all of these things, I have heard so many times of people getting their job back, getting back pay, getting all of these things because the union protected them. So it's really important, like I said, to have your diversity in your union, your diversity in your bargaining team, and make sure that the union looks like your workforce. And if it does, then you have the best shot possible to protect everybody at that workplace.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. And I do want to emphasize also, just to go on the point of Jeremy saying, make sure your union committee looks like your workforce, that includes survivors, right? If you have survivors on staff, you want to make sure you have survivors in your committee as well. And so we were getting a couple of questions in the chat. We have one in the Q&A. So Jannine, I want to ask you, I'm so sorry, Jannine or Kiki, one of you organized and unionized remotely. So if you can speak on that, and then also, maybe it was both of you, and then also thinking about Jannine, how do you think about, I guess this is the similar question with while you're working remotely and and whether it's in person, what are some of the strategies that you and your colleagues use to collect signatures? And what's the process between like, we're having text conversations or we're giving each other the eye of like, what the heck is going on, to actual collecting signatures? And what does that process look like?
Sure. Kiki, do you want to go ahead first about organizing remotely?
Totally. Yeah. I was going to say the big word that comes to mind is over communication. And some folks may hear just in general in work, right? Like we're using Signal Chat, we're using Google Drive, we're using text messages, we're using like all non-work channels, of course. Because don't do it on your, don't do it with your work email or anything, you know, making sure we're logged into our personal Zooms, not our work Zooms. You know, I think also part of that over communication was strategizing on supporting people who, for reasons even outside the workplace, are checked out, right? Like we're unionizing in the scope of ongoing, you know, anti-Black racism, you know, ongoing transphobia that is obviously extremely violent and causing mass deaths. You know, not trying to say that responsibly, but yeah. And so with over communication, you know, we had to create, for example, like a phone tree, which is, you know, kind of this hierarchy. Yeah, terrible time to use the word hierarchy, but you get it just for picture's sake. Right, so I would be at the top here, and then I was in charge of communicating out to two people who would then be in charge of communicating out to other people. And so we would use that for any like urgent messages, urgent decisions that to be made, any updates coming up. We also created an email in order to be able to inform people. Because especially with remote work, we're asking people to then dedicate extra time outside of the time that they're already paid, may even be underpaid for, to give attention and help make decisions. And it's hard to be checked in at a time where sustainability is feeling really hard.
And then when it comes to strategies that we used, we were also organizing remotely, and we had a little bit of a different structure from Kiki at AVP. What we had done was we had a pretty large organizing committee, and when we had that list of people who work at the agency, we split it up. So everyone was in charge of a couple of people, and we would follow up amongst ourselves to be like, hey, have you reached out to this person? We would use an Excel sheet to track, to make sure that we were really keeping on schedule with things, making sure that we were keeping things moving forward, keep up that momentum. And I think one of the biggest capacity builders for our campaign was to really create a conversation guide, which I've sent to Sharon to send over to you guys so that you can use it in your campaigns, because I want you all to unionize. And because we were doing everything over the phone, we were sort of, if we could get somebody on the phone, of course through personal, we would use that conversation to say, hey, we're trying to start a union. I'd love to talk to you about it. I wanted to know, do you have about like 15, 20 minutes to talk to me? And sometimes we could, you know, connect with people in a way that like wasn't just out of nowhere, but very often it would just be a cold call. Like we'd get this person's number and then we would call them and then we would just launch into it. And that can be kind of scary. So having this conversation guide, I think it really helped to keep people from freezing, but also to keep them on task, because, you know, when you're organizing, a good organizer or a good organizing conversation is you're listening 80% of the time. You really should not be talking that much. You're trying to hear them, to listen to them. And especially because, you know, we were organizing 160 staff. We were, of course, trying to get them to sign cards, but we were genuinely trying to understand everyone's conditions and their experiences at Sanctuary, because we were specifically trying to make a wall-to-wall union, meaning a union for everybody that's not management. So maintenance, counselors, RAs, like residential assistants, the project assistants, all of those people, we wanted them in one union, because having a bigger union means more power, of course, all these things. So for having a union for everybody, we really want to understand everybody's situation. So having this conversation guide, it really helped us to ask the right questions, because it can be hard, especially when you're on the phone. And after we had that initial conversation, we'd send a follow-up email with some literature, getting into the nuts and bolts of things. And most people were not ready with one conversation. And really going back to what Kiki was talking about safety, and Sharon talking about, this is our protected right. It required us to do a lot of education to really get over that fear, because I think that was the biggest hurdle for people, that they were afraid of what could happen, because there's only 10% of American workers are in unions. Like, people really, they absorb a lot of union or anti-union propaganda. They just don't know. And so it required us to do, a little bit of education to say, this is your protected right. This is a protected activity. Of course, like Jerame said, agencies trample on them all the time. But it also required us to do a little bit of pushing. Oh, it also required us to say, hey, these cards are completely confidential. The agency is never going to know that you individually signed. They're only ever going to know the number of people who signed. That one was big in being like, oh, actually, maybe I could do this. But the other thing was, it required, we wanted to push back a little bit. We wanted to say, hey, doesn't that fear show how much we need a union if we're all this scared to just do this thing that we're allowed to do? Or, hey, doesn't this show how much we need to band together and show the strength and the unity in our numbers? So we really wanted to turn it on its head. And I think those were some of the biggest strategies that really helped us move things along.
Thanks so much. And I have a question as I'm listening. So this is not for a specific person, but can somebody describe in broad strokes so when you say collecting cards, what does that mean? Why is that important? What does that lead to? And how do you get to collecting cards? What is that process?
Kiki, do you want to take it? Because you guys did it first.
Thank you. Yes. So again, I should know the terminology well by now, but I'm still learning along the way. As somebody says, we're building the plane as we fly it. And so I'm going to invoke Jerame to definitely correct me on some things. So, right, when you are going to a vote, you want to collect cards, right? And so for us, we did it using, I believe, a form online, especially working remotely. Similar to what Jannine said, you're going to want to share that, right, this is confidential. We had to look into making sure we had one for counting them, make sure that we had a third party that everybody agreed to, that also our organization, the main organization, agreed to count those cards. We got the majority. And so even with that, we were voluntarily recognized. Yeah, so that was a bit of our process, very broad overview, but those cards are kind of like what you think about, like a voting ballot in that way.
So with the cards are there so that people who are eligible can decide whether or not they want to be part of a union. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So it would be that first is the initial conversations between staff, and then it's thinking of, what is the step between these initial conversations and then the cards? Because it's not like we're going to have this conversation and we're going to, what card is it? Who gives us the card? Where do we get that from?
Take that one.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jared.
Oh, I was just going to say the process, between kind of those initial conversations and time to sign the cards is really it's that strategy session, right? It's those conversations. You're talking. You're building critical mass. So those cards are important because everybody who signs a union card is indicating, their support for the union, their desire to be in a union. When you do that, when you reveal that process, you want to know that you're going to win, right? That you're going to have at least 50% plus one of the eligible employees for the union to have signed a card. So it's part of it's about a feeling, because you may not be able to talk to 50% plus one of the people that you're trying to unionize, or you have to trust that other people are having those conversations and so forth. But you get to a point to where, no, you think you've got the majority. It's time to go public. It's time to to get people to sign cards, it's time to, and then, if enough people sign cards, you can get voluntary recognition, or it gets thrown to the National Labor Relations Board, who conducts an election. And that's a whole process. You may have seen, it just recently happened for Amazon, and Amazon went all out, even putting signs in toilet stalls, trying to tell people not to vote for the union. So elections can get, really drawn out and really ugly. And so, it's obviously preferred to get voluntary recognition, but so many of our progressive organizations that express these kind of liberal values then turn around and don't necessarily do that when it comes to letting their own staff unionize. So, I mean, I've seen a number of really good questions in the chat about, picking your union and who represents you and that kind of stuff. And, that depends. I mean, y'all had like different experiences with who you chose to represent you. Part of it is what unions are strong in the area, in the geographic area that you're in, right? You don't want to pick a union that doesn't have any staff or any other locals in your area, because you're not going to have the kind of support you need. There are a number, it used to be that unions were much more focused on a specific industry, like here or there, but really that's not so much the case anymore. A number of unions have merged together. So now you have like the steel workers who also organize, lawyers who also organize, casino workers, and university staff. So, it's kind of a hodgepodge. So you look at kind of what your issues are, and then, you do the union shopping, like they were talking about, of finding, who best matches your values, and, who's going to fight, you think is going to fight the most to get you what you need.
Thanks. To go off with that question, Jannine or Kiki, can you talk a little bit about what that union shopping looked like for the process that you both went through with your respective organizations? And I think it was Vanessa's question of what factors should they consider when choosing a union?
That really depends on what your goals are. So for us, our priorities were, of course, we wanted a union that was going to fight for us, but most unions nowadays, they're all great at contract negotiation. So we were treating them all as like pretty equivalent in that way. So the things that we were really focusing on was we wanted a militant union that really could give us an outlet for collective action, because that was important to us. We really wanted to have the union be a space for us to have that infrastructure to start those like really common sense advocacy goals that we couldn't necessarily do through the sanctuary infrastructure, to like advocate for them through the union. So we really wanted to have a good militant union that had like some political infrastructure. So that meant looking for unions that had a big network in the city so that we could, link up with other service providers that were similar in the space and like were oriented towards human services like we were, that had like good political networks, meaning like they were connected. So we were kind of looking at some bigger unions, but I mean, that's not as big of an issue now because most unions are part of like the 4 big ones. And what else were we looking at? We were looking at network in the city that were close to us, affinity between the different organizations, the militancy, and we were also looking at like what political or what advocacy things they were already involved in. So there were a number of unions that fit that had a good presence in the city. And we went through, we had a couple of back and forths. We did our preliminary research, and then we sent it to a vote to our organizing committee. And we said, hey, these are the things, this is the research. We summarized, we had like a little team of, I think like 1 or 2 to do the research. And then we put it in a Google form with like the pros and cons, and we sent it to our team, and that's how we decided and settled on the National Organization of Legal Service Workers, which is, it's national, it's under UAW, and they have a good number of people in the city.
I saw a question about, in the chat. I think it was, I can't find the chat, it went away, but thinking through what would it look like to create a union or to unionize the entire gender-based violence movement? What would that do for us, do you think?
I mean, I think that it would just really enforce the organization to practice the values they say they have, right? You know, so part of my job, for example, is that I work with survivors of state violence, people who are facing criminal charges. And I've seen the ways in which IPV, funny enough, and gender-based violence, power and control dynamics are repeated in the state systems. And then at times I had to sit and say, like, these are things also being repeated within my organization, right? Like power and control dynamics that are beyond kind of like that agreed to power structure of like your supervisor and then the manager and then the board, right? And people were tired of that, right? And I think people were hesitant because they didn't want to say like, I am in a toxic relationship with my workplace, right? I financially am dependent on them. You know, this is part of like for my career advancement. I actually really love the work, right? But maybe I don't like where I'm doing it. I think we hear that a lot too, right? Like I love the work that we do. I love like how unique we are. The Anti-Violence Project coordinates so much and it does an amazing amount of work. And I am proud of us of how far we've come. And there are some positive things, but obviously we needed some change if we felt that we needed to unionize, and that's what we did. But I think that that is my answer to that question in terms of really another, well, a more forceful accountability system to say like, we represent survivors, we are survivors, right? Even if maybe you're not a survivor of the forms of violence you represent, you may have faced some form of toxicity and some level of violence at your workplace, and you're a survivor in that, and you deserve that retribution and you deserve that accountability from your workplace.
Love that, thank you. Anyone else want to add anything to that?
I mean, yes, Kiki, yes. I think the accountability piece is really important. We're working specifically in domestic violence, and I think, you know, it's time for us to recognize that we need to do more and we need to do differently. In the 20, 30 years since VAWA has passed, we haven't seen a reduction in the rates of domestic violence. We have to start exploring different approaches, and we need to be able to advocate for them because no one's going to listen to us otherwise. And unions can allow us that voice. Having a collective, having a network of DV organizations that are unionized, those labor coalitions are super, super, super strong, and they offer a lot of space and opportunity for that collective advocacy. There's the Coalition of Labor Union Women, which was like the first anti-war labor coalition. There's Labor Fights Back, which is a specifically anti-racist labor coalition. There are a lot of spaces that are coalitions of unions from across the nation in a variety of sectors, but think about how powerful it could be if there was a specific coalition, a specific labor coalition of anti-violence agencies or specifically anti-DV agencies. I think just the possibilities are completely endless, and we just need to get there.
Thank you, both of you, for that. I do want to continue with our questions, even though please continue with your Q&As, everyone. Would love to hopefully get to them. So Kiki, I think Jannine had at one point said that the process was really quick. It only took 5 months. And for me, I'm like, 5 months, that's so long, right? So we know that the process of unionizing is long and difficult, and oftentimes it's unpaid. It's unpaid labor that we're asking staff to do in addition to everything else that they're doing. How do we ensure that we're taking care of ourselves and our colleagues during this process?
No, totally. Thank you. I think one, just for context too, my organization is not more than like 40 people. So I think that already helps us, especially when I talk about the interpersonal and the connections that we've made with one another. And that has allowed, I think, for some folks, not everybody to know what's going on in the union, but sometimes you just need that other person to know what's going on in your personal life or how work is affecting you, right? And like I said too, right, like we're unionizing in the greater context of ongoing systems of oppression and violence, right? And so that doesn't stop. And so I think it is one for the people with privileged identities to continue the aspiring allyship work within unions, right? you have in some ways systemically have more allowed mind space maybe, or even if you're not of privileged identities, but you find yourself maybe being able to navigate these things easier, or maybe digest the language, right? Accessibility is a huge thing. And that also is a part of sustainability, right? Is the language and terminology like digestible, right? Like how are you maybe using the phone tree to check in on people? I think a big thing again is safety planning along the whole way, right? When we decided to go public, I remember somebody noted as like, oh my God, I have supervision tomorrow actually. So, you know, we all kind of knew like, let's check in on this person because they're the first person to be talking with someone of management or leadership literally the day after we're going public, right? And so I would say again, like I bring up interpersonal a lot, but I think that is such a strength of my workplace. A lot of us have become close friends, or just acknowledging that some people are going through tougher times than others, right? I think just asking for as much space as possible, right? We're in the bargaining. We're bargaining right now. And so I think it's hard because we're navigating how are we holding the team accountable and making sure that we're getting everyone's thoughts and opinions, and knowing that some people, as soon as they clock out from the workday, they're clocked out from everything, right? And so again, that over communication, but making sure like the pieces of information that we need are digestible, you know, maybe not sending not just a long document of like, these are the proposals we're looking at, but like really making it to be like, you can check in with me, right? If you need it verbally told to you, if you need to maybe just check in even about non-union stuff, maybe even stuff that you don't like about the union so far, right? Like a lot of times the union can still replicate a lot of harmful dynamics, right? It can still replicate microaggressions can still exist within the union, right? And so, you know, how are we holding ourselves accountable in those ways as well?
Which is a great question to pivot to Jerame as we think about, you know, all institutions, all groups, government, workplaces, unions, we're all capable of harm because that's just the nature of interpersonal relationships. So how do we ensure that we are being inclusive of all people and their voices within unions as we talk about making sure that our committee, our unionizing committee reflects the workers that are in the workplace?
That's a great question. I mean, it's a challenge. Because you know you have to be proactive about inclusion. Inclusion doesn't happen. It's not something that's just automatic or natural. Like every human on the planet prefers people who think and act like them. You know, so like there are automatic biases in literally every person. So you know you have to be conscious about seeking out people who disagree with you, who maybe have a different point of view, and really engaging with them in a concrete way to understand their needs, to understand their desires, and what's going on. Like, you know, I think Jannine and Kiki both were saying, you know, have been talking about the interpersonal relationships. And if you're going to organize a union, you're going to have to build relationships with people you don't like. Like there are coworkers that we just don't like, let's be honest. But you're still going to have to build some kind of working relationship with them to be able to talk about the unions and the problems in the workplace that they are experiencing too, because their voice matters, their voice is important. And in fact, you know, sometimes it's those, you know, that are on the outside or on the outskirts that need the union the most. So seeking them out and bringing them in is absolutely critical. So, you know, I think what it boils down to is intentionality. You know, like I said at the start, it's really an intentional thing to look at your workplace and see who's there and make sure that you're talking to everybody that you can talk to, and bringing them into the fold and bringing them into the conversation, even if they disagree, even if you don't like what they have to say.
Anything you both want to add before I jump into our last prepared question? Okay, so the last question that we have from us is, what do you wish, and this is for everyone who wants to answer, what do you wish you had known before you started the unionizing process that you know now that you can share with our audience members who may want to be, or is thinking about, or wants to play with the idea of unionizing?
I mean, I think for me, again, because I'm in that learning process of one, and Jannine kind of spoke to it earlier, where it can be awkward to approach people to talk about it, especially because, right, thinking about how if you need a union, you may have high turnover, right? So what does it mean to then have to like onboard new staff as you're also like at the beginning of your union stages? And so we're part of that too, where it's like, okay, we're doing this, but we also need to reach out to new staff, check in with them. And you haven't developed that kind of like connection with them yet, right? Like you just learned their name, their pronouns, and their position at the staff meeting, you know, and you're like, okay, I think you're eligible. Let's figure that out. But I think being prepared for awkward conversations, being prepared to not know everything and having to really sit and learn the language, right? Like, again, I'm in that learning process, as you all see. And so that way you can, with time, be a bit more knowledgeable and be able to talk about it and have a conversation, right? That's part of the core, just having a conversation about it, not telling people.
One of the reasons that I said 5 months from planning to execution and like a 9-week card campaign, like signing cards for 160 staff is pretty fast, is because we did try to unionize a couple years ago and it failed pretty miserably, and it went on for like a year and a half. So comparatively, and also like in the scheme of things for an organization that size, it is pretty quick. But anything that we didn't know, we did know because we did try and we failed. And while it sucked at the time, it really was, I think, so great because it was such a generative experience and it gave us so much that's made us stronger this time around. We've said it so many times just in this meeting already. There has to be follow-up within the organizing committee, that you have to be checking in with each other to say, hey, do you have everything you need to complete this task? Hey, do you need any support on this task? Hey, do you just need this taken off your plate? To really have that open and proactive communication, so that the lines are always open, so that people can step back and step forward without feeling this pressure. It keeps the momentum going. It made us stronger. And, it really is about the well-being of our people. That's what we're doing this for. And that made us stronger. Another thing is you're never going to know what's going to happen. Even now, I don't know what's happening, but we're still doing it, and it's going to be fine, and it's going to be great. We're going into bargaining. We're about to, we're getting ready to negotiate our first contract. I have no idea what's going to happen, but every other agency that has a union, they had to do it at some point. They did it, so will we. And that is because we have an excellent team, and we have a really good relationship of mutual respect and support with our union organizers. Shout out Lily and Rich. And I hope that those can offer some assurance to people who are looking to start their own unions, because you may not know what's happening, but you're going to do it.
Yeah, I think that for me, like, I've never been in a union organizing space myself, but like just coming into the labor movement and working in the labor movement, the thing that is such a barrier is the language. It's the culture. It is very different from like most other workplaces. People talk to each other differently. They use different language. There's much more of a family kind of feeling sometimes in those workplaces. People call each other brothers and sisters. We also encourage them to use siblings. But that language of "you are my brother, you are my sister" is part of the labor movement and has been from the beginning. So understanding that there's that the people that you're bringing in to help you organize in the union are going to have kind of a different perspective and a different culture and a different language, and you're going to have to learn that. And that can sometimes be a barrier. Is such an important thing. The other thing I wanted to mention was somebody in the chat had mentioned, finding out if the union itself has a staff union, and looking to see if they're still more of a bread and butter kind of union that only pays attention to benefits and working conditions and wages, or if they've shifted to a more social justice stance. There's a real bifurcation in the labor movement about which unions are doing what. Like, some unions see themselves as, no, we negotiate wages, benefits, and working conditions, and that's it. That's all we do. Other people see that they need to make sure that the whole worker is protected. and that, you know, what happens at home can have an impact on work. And, you know, those unions that understand that are just, they're the better unions, especially in the nonprofit space, the anti-violence space, you know, any of that, they're just going to be the better unions to work with because they understand the issues, because they're already working.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, so we have 2 minutes. And there was a question that I wanted to bring up as our last question. Okay, so this is an open question and this will be our last question. I'm so sorry for everyone whose questions we haven't gotten to, but can you talk a little bit about how unions can help address problems with things like culture change, right? We get it for unions for workplace discrimination and pay, but how do unions help with culture changes, which often may not be the greatest in some workplaces?
Oh, I can go on that. Like, so that literally goes back to what I was just saying about finding a union that understands social justice, that understands the broader aspects of the workplace rather than just wages, benefits, and working conditions, because they are going to have the expertise and the experience to know, okay, well, this workplace needs some anti-racism. This workplace has some seriously misogynistic people in the upper management, and that needs to get fixed. Like, those are things that you can bargain into your contract, that certain types of trainings be done, that certain procedures be followed or be created. All of those things are totally bargainable. Like, in reality, there's not a lot that's off the table when it comes to bargaining in your contract. You know, in a lot of ways, the sky's the limit. It's what you can get everybody to agree that they want, and get the employer to agree to give to you in that contract. So, you know, if you want culture change, then you decide what it's going to take to change the culture. What is it that you think as a group is going to change the culture in this workplace? And then you demand that in your bargaining session, and you put it in your contract. This is what we want, and this is how we're going to get it. And then you hold them accountable to that.
Okay. Jannine or Kiki, any last words or nuggets of wisdom that you can share with us?
I mean, I think to also add to what Jeremy's saying is, you know, depending on whether you decide to leave the organization, grow in the organization, remain in your position just how you like it. I think also, right, with the union kind of in a way forcing these challenges to power, and in a way redistributing power to, right, the frontline folks and the folks doing a lot of the work at the base of the organization. Also reflecting on your own accountability, right? Are these structures of accountability you're putting in place for cultural change that you will also uplift and you will also practice if you're the one being held accountable, right? You know, as you find kind of that, I think, trust within your union, right, that also means it will in a way apply back to you, right? Especially if we are redistributing power. You know, obviously still hold your management and your leadership accountable. I guess, again, just learning that, you know, you're also a part of that collaborative process.
I'll be brief because I think Kiki and Jeremy covered it so well, but I'll just say a union is only as strong as its members. And if you guys want to have this culture change, you need to be focusing on developing your membership and enacting that culture change in and of your own structure. You can have the support from the union, but if you don't have that commitment amongst your own people and that unity amongst your own people, that education with your people, you know, there's only so much that the union rep is going to be able to do for you guys. And I think for us, that was something that we really focused on. You know, we didn't get as militant a union as we wanted because we thought that there were some stances that would be hard sells for our membership, but we said it's going to be okay because we're going to be able to whip up our people and develop their political consciousness through the union so that we can get the things that we wanted.
Really quick, the other thing that I would add is a lot of the larger unions have their own programs within the union that they use for culture change and for education and so forth. Like every union of any size has an education program where they They bring members in and they educate them on everything from anti-racism to, you know, just basic what the law is, how to have interpersonal relations with each other. Like there's all of those resources within the union that you can tap into as well.
Okay, everyone, I feel like we can just continue this conversation on and on, but we are 3 minutes past time. To be respectful of all of our times, I am going to cut it here, but I love this discussion. Freeform will continue to have and host discussions like this one. If you have any questions or anything that we weren't able to get to today, please email us. My email is in the chat, and I believe Jannine also dropped her email in the chat. I will be sending out a follow-up email with this recording. And please continue to engage with this conversation. The goal at Freeform, my personal goal, our goals, is really to think about a gender-based violence movement that is more sustainable, that is survivor-centered, that is accountable to the people who work in it and to the clients that we work with. Okay, thank you everyone so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and you'll be hearing a lot from us soon. Bye, everyone.